Hello, today I'm going to be reviewing the new movie, The Glass Castle, which just came out this past Friday, the 11th of August. And I am picking this film to review. I haven't done a ton of film reviews on this channel, but I do plan on doing more going forward. But one of the reasons why this movie in particular is kind of so important to me is that this is a movie that is based off of a novel, which is very quite popular. It spent, I believe, oh my gosh, it was like 5 or 7 years on the bestseller New York Times bestseller list. I mean, it was up there for a long time. The Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls, a memoir about Jeanette's upbringing and into early adulthood. And Jeanette Walls herself actually is my aunt's sister-in-law. So I'm not Jeanette, I'm not actually related to her, but she is an aunt to several of my cousins on my mom's side. And, John and Jeanette, her husband, John Taylor, is the brother of one of my aunts. And my mother has actually met John Taylor. She's never met Jeanette herself. But she's met her husband. And again, my cousins always have talked about Aunt Jeanette. So it's cool. She always has been a household name, even for my family, and especially for my extended family. Because Jeanette now lives in Virginia with her husband. Now, she did get remarried. In the film, we do not see John Taylor at all because the film does not go that far in her timeline. We only get to the early 90s, and at that point, she had first married her first husband, and who was portrayed by Max Greenfield in the movie. And they, of course, they do get divorced later on, and she remarries. But that's touched on in the book, but is not touched on in the movie. And that's one of the big distinctions here is that obviously when you're adapting a book to a movie, there are things that you have to omit. It's not an exceedingly long book, and the movie is actually not short. It does go, a decent runtime, over an hour and a half, but it is omitting a lot of things that I was, to be honest, a little surprised at one point, going through and seeing it, what they did choose to omit. This film focuses a lot more on adult Jeanette in New York City writing for that gossip column. And it's obvious that they wanted to feature Brie Larson a little more prominently. She is the standout and lead actress in this movie, and they didn't want to just make Brie Larson's role feel very secondary. They also chose not to do what Lion did, which was another really good movie that came out recently, where, Dev Patel was playing the adult, character, and they didn't even give him screen time until over an hour into the film, because the first half of the film was all the backstory and his childhood. Instead of waiting to get Brie Larson onto the screen, they actually open with her and then they flash back and forth, which I thought was a clever way of doing it. It allowed, certain scenes to have a little bit more moral weight to them because they would relate to what she was remembering in the present moment, going back, flashing back to her family's past. So I was okay with that idea, and I wasn't, it's not how the book does it necessarily, although the book does start out with the present and then her going back into the past and then moving right back up. But so the film opens in a similar way. There is a really interesting dynamic here. Jeanette was very afraid about this movie being made for so many years. This book was published in 2005. So for 12 years, this movie was having trouble being made, and it was greenlit by a few producers. Jennifer Lawrence at one point was on board to actually produce this movie, as well as possibly star in it. But then she never ended up doing anything with it, which was a real shame. And until finally it got picked up, and Daniel Destin Cretton, who is the director, finally, got this ball rolling, and then assembled this ensemble cast of Brie Larson, Naomi Watts, and Woody Harrelson to play her mother and father, respectively. An excellent casting choice. Seriously, they play Rosemary and Rex Walls so well. Jeanette was so concerned when going into this movie that it was going to be too Hollywoodized, as she said, and that it wasn't going to feel that real or authentic. Or, she had said that there were other angles they were thinking about taking the story and deviating a bit from her source material. This movie, they got everything to the T so authentically correct. The director, Cretton, spent so much time talking with Jeanette, trying to get everything to be as real for her as possible, to the point where she even says it was quite emotional and almost frightening for her to see Naomi Watts, and particularly Woody Harrelson, who is the standout performer in this movie, portray her, semi or definitely alcoholic father in this light that was so perfect in his mannerisms and the way he really embodied the character. And of course, wearing all the clothes. Brie Larson wears some of the 80s authentic power suits that Jeanette actually owned that she gave to her to wear. And also, Rosemary, who plays the mother, is this sort of eccentric, try to be a painter. She's painting all the time. She's not taking care of her family at all, but she's making sure she's painting for them. And they actually used her real painting because Rosemary is still alive. She lives with John and Jeanette in Virginia currently, whereas Rex Walls passed away in 1994. So Rosemary actually loved the book when it came out, even though that the book was not necessarily saying great things about her. And the one interesting thing that I will pick up from this movie that differentiates from the book quite a bit is that this movie is a lot more about Rex Walls than it is about Rosemary, the mother. I think the book deals with Rosemary a lot more and her shortcomings as a mother. She basically at some points really did not try to feed her children. She went back and forth between kind of feeling like she was a mother and also just not wanting to have anything to do with being that role. But this film, and the book also dealt heavily with Rex's, abuse, his alcoholism, his neglect of the children. Obviously, his glass castle, which was the dream that he wanted to build. He was this engineer, but you know, he was so wrapped up in, controversies about the outside world. He didn't want to be a part of the city world or city life. He could never hold down a job because he just felt like it was, not the right work for him. He felt like he was better than a lot of people or better than everyone else. And so the movie really decides to pinpoint on Rex's relationship with his children. And instead, Rosemary, there's only a few scenes where her shortcomings are really highlighted. Towards the end of the film, even when Rosemary's still actually with the kids, the blame is never really put on her. Brie Larson's character, Jeanette, is really placing all the blame of her horrible childhood onto her father, even though you find out later on in the film that it was actually her mother who actually had all of this potential money sitting in land that she could have sold all these years, that her father knew about and didn't say anything, but she doesn't get so angry at her mother for not selling the land. She instead takes it back all out on her father, which again, in the book, it doesn't quite discuss quite being so much like that. So this movie is about redemption for Rex Walls, even though he does all of these horrible things and, the endearing sort of connection he has in particular with Jeanette, the main character, is really, it really makes you love and loathe the character. And Woody Harrelson's performance is so stellar in that regard. I was going into this film thinking, gosh, I didn't really care that much about Rex. He was a very, there were elements of him that were so loving and pure that they were trying, and Jeanette is definitely trying to forgive him through writing this memoir. She's trying to move on and accept that people are different. People always are messed up, and they take that and put it on their other people. And you can't, be so wrapped up in hate that you never even forgive them, because he does pass away prematurely somewhat, and Brie Larson does decide at the end to see him before he passes, even though she feels as though she cannot forgive him at this point. She ultimately does. And that's a moral story that this film is, lathered on with, is this, tale of forgiveness ultimately, and finding hope in such unconventional times and unconventional circumstances. Obviously it's a trial of redemption. It's a trial of overcoming things. It's not too comedic. There are some scenes that could angle on that side. There are so many things in the book that are so dark, and like reading about how horrible their their life, basic poverty was growing up. But there were some neglectful things about their parents that, in the way Jeanette kind of writes it, you can't help but laugh. The fact that they would do the skedaddle out of hospitals to get out of paying hospital bills, or the fact that even at one point, Jeanette, as a child, fell out of a car and their parents were just driving and they never even bothered to pick her up because they didn't even notice for like 20 miles that she had fallen out. The way Jeanette writes it makes you almost laugh because she doesn't talk about it as being such a horrific experience. But these things are omitted from the film. There's only a few. You see her catching on fire when she's trying to cook over the stove at 3 or 4 years old. One of the most scary things that she has to ever overcome, leaving horrible scars that she shows her then husband, or to-be husband, fiance at the time, as sort of I have pasts here that are very dark. I have demons haunting me, which was a nice trope to help, enter you back into her backstory. So basically, Woody Harrelson is the central figure here. We end up loving him and loathing him. His performance is so endearing, it's so emotional, it's so multidimensional that I actually really ended up feeling for him. I actually ended up seeing all the sides to Rex Walls, not just the abusive, alcoholic, neglectful, misogynistic side, because he doesn't treat Naomi Watts' character very well at all. And there's one very powerful scene that, is about domestic abuse and domestic violence, which is portrayed very effectively. And there are certain scenes in this film that really grab you in and really tell the story so raw and realistically through some of the writing and the cinematography. That's where this movie really shines. For me, there are some things about this movie that did detract and I wasn't so, crazy about. I didn't like that they did focus so much on her in New York City and not so much on her past. There were so many things they omitted, like the entire time they went to Santa Fe and stayed in an old house in which they couldn't even afford to pay for, air conditioning, so they would just have to leave the doors and windows open while they slept. To which one point they actually had strangers come into their house and literally sleep in there. And they just had to get used to it because they needed air in the house. I mean, there were all these things, and then they just abandoned the house. They didn't even try and sell it. That's completely omitted from the story. It's mostly focused on their time in Welch, West Virginia. Ella Anderson, who plays an 11-year-old Jeanette, is phenomenal in this role. She carries all of this emotional weight that's really hard for a child of that age to comprehend. Jeanette was amazed by her performance and how real it felt. And it really, for an 11-year-old to understand all of this stuff, I mean, they had to grow up so soon, saving up all their money to try and take care of themselves while their parents were completely doing the opposite, and to save up to move to New York. And then, of course, Rex's true kind of darkness comes out when he actually steals all this money that Jeanette has been saving up and spends it on booze and alcohol instead, as sort of this domineering tactic of, you're my little girl, I'm still going to take care of you, I'm the man of the house. You can't usurp my manhood by trying to take care of yourself, or even, but God forbid, trying to take care of me. And that is a dynamic that, again, is really well portrayed in this film. You get the sense of his fragile masculinity in, all of those scenes with her fiance, Max Greenfield, with the arm wrestling scene. Unconventional. It wasn't really in the book, but I think it was played out really well to sort of give you all of these sides of Rex's character. Again, it doesn't flesh out so many of the other characters so well, like her siblings or the mother as much, but it really focuses on Rex and makes you feel so strongly about his character, even though he's done all these horrible things. I will say he definitely deserves an Oscar nod for this performance. I know that's been in the talks, so it'll be interesting to see come Oscar season if Woody Harrelson may pick up a nomination for Best Male Actor in Leading Role. We'll see. There's a lot of, potential with this film to be Oscar worthy. Do I think it's going to get much more than maybe Woody Harrelson's nod? Probably not, which is a shame to me because I really was so excited to hear this was going to be made. This is kind of a big deal for my family, and that's why I had to make this review for it. But ultimately, I do think that this movie really did shine in so many efforts and so much authenticity and so much grittiness and realness that a lot of Hollywood films don't necessarily touch on. It is not a big blockbuster film, but it has blockbuster, cast members, and it's actually quite, I'm surprised to see it being so popular. And I'm hoping that, it's a movie that a lot of people will go to see, and especially anyone who has a similar upbringing can relate to. So many people related to the book. So many people came up to Jeanette saying this was just one of the most amazing things, looking at family and the complicated kind of network that it is, and understanding forgiveness and redemption. All of these themes are so well played in her book, and the movie is just helping that. It's not hurting it in any way. Any downsides that I would have to the film are, again, I felt like they didn't necessarily spend as much time focusing on some of the true horrific sort of dark aspects of their past. But they did touch on it, like the sexual abuse by their aunt Irma to their son, to Jeanette's brother Brian. It's touched on, but then it's sort of, you move on from it. They go into those things, but yes, maybe they could have been explored a little bit more. But then again, you have the book. This is all meant to, make you remember, you need to read the book. You know, we can't give you everything. So ultimately, for me, I didn't have much of a problem with anything about this movie. It didn't feel too cheesy or too forced, and the comedy did not feel like it was making fun of something. Like, let's turn this into a movie and like about laughing at hillbillies, because it could go in that direction. This is all, you know, meant to bring tears to your eyes. This is all meant to make you really feel for these people in this situation, and meant to really show you how you can overcome anything. You can grow up from this kind of craziness and grow into being a best-selling author, and all of her children are doing so well now. All have moved on. It's great to see that Rosemary seems to really accept this, that she's not really bitter that this is being told. She kind of thinks that it's more portraying her artwork and promoting her in a way, and you know, maybe there is some delusion in that, because there, you know, as an artist myself, there's some interesting parallels that I can draw with Rosemary and her psyche and her understanding of her art. And of course, just the fact that Rex and Rosemary just wanted to be such bohemians to begin with and off the grid. You know, I can understand it, but at the same time, you cannot understand the fact that they were just so neglectful and so unable to just feed their children. And so for me, you do get a sense of that. Maybe it could have been played up more, but again, you need to read the book. And so for all that authenticity and for all the facts that it made Jeanette Walls feel so eerily connected to these cast members and all the flashbacks, this is a good movie for me, and I highly recommend seeing it. I know it's got mixed reviews, saying, you know, it's a little too slow paced. It's more just about Brie Larson walking around in 80s power suits, you know, living this glamorous New York 80s lifestyle. I get that. And some of it does feel a little forced. What Brie is given, she does very well with, but she's not given that much. And when she is forced to play a teenager living in Welch, which she does look a little old for, but I'm glad they did put her in that role. That's where she really does shine, and where she really kind of uses like that in the moment sort of energy to really craft the emotion that this film is trying to get at. So for me, I highly recommend you seeing this film. I'm so proud of Jeanette and everyone for putting this together. And to the director, he did a really good job, I think. Other directors would have Hollywoodized this film far too much, to the point where we wouldn't even be considering Oscar possibilities. And again, Woody Harrelson, absolutely phenomenal performance. But as to everyone in the cast, very well done. So that is my review of The Glass Castle. Definitely a must-see in my opinion. And also, I highly recommend the book. So thanks for watching. I will be doing more movie reviews coming up as we move through the fall. And check out my music reviews. I've been doing a ton of album reviews, so I've got a ton of them on the channel, and I got a ton more I'm going to be doing in the next few months. So stay tuned for all of that, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you, and bye.